A subject that comes up now and again is nationalist economics or nationalist commerce, nationalist forms of business. And I want to talk about that here in particular with a view to suggesting that employee-owned businesses fit the bill, are a form or the form, should be the form of nationalist economics. By employee-owned, I mean a business in which employees are not paid a wage where you turn up and go home and get money at the end of the week, but where employees are paid as owners, as shareholders, specifically paid in dividends on the shares that they own in the business, so not as mere simple wage earners. Now, I don't propose this merely because I think it might be a nationalist form of business, but because my reason for proposing it is because I think it will create a better atmosphere to grow the bonds of affection and commonality between people. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But I also think it would fit the bill as a form of cohesive nation-building, effectively nationalistic economics. So I'd like to talk about that here, but partly also because I think there's a whole load of drivel, a whole load of nonsense that people talk about. If you buy your pickled onions from the local farm shop, or if you get your erotic candles from somebody who shares your politics, or something about sticking a caravan in a field without planning permission, that's some kind of nationalist economics. No, none of those things are. They don't really affect anything. Just buying from someone who shares your opinions, that is to call that skin deep would be to exaggerate the depth of it. Chiefly, I think it has. What I want to go through is reasons why I think it would be beneficial, why I like it, why it would create good dynamics. And then I hope it'll be easy to see why it could be called a nationalist form of business. Now, the three basic reasons that I would talk about are fairness, friendship, and freedom. So if I talk about the first one, fairness, but by fairer, I mean more equal. I think an effective form of employee-owned business, an effective employee-owned system, reverses the trend towards ever greater concentration of wealth. In a traditional company where it's owned by a few people and employees just turn up and get paid money, the trend is for shares to get concentrated in the hands of one person, because that means control, and control is what is valuable. Because if you have control, you can direct the profit stream into your own pockets. So that 51st share, having 51% of the shares, that is what creates the value. And having less than 50% of shares, I'm talking about in a private company here, having less than 50%, that means you're out of control, and that means that those shares are not so valuable to you. So ownership, meaning control, that tends to create a motor for ever greater concentration of ownership of the means of production, of wealth creation. And in turn, I think that creates an ever greater concentration of wealth as a result. An employee-owned business, an effective employee-owned business, I think reverses that trend, because it means that a share has more value in the hands of an employee than in the hands of a single owner, because a share in the hands of a motivated employee will create incentives, and it will create the motivation in that employee to coordinate and cooperate effectively with colleagues, which makes the business more valuable, makes it more productive and more profitable. And that, by making shares more valuable in the hands of employees, that tends to widen ownership, to spread ownership amongst more people, and to reverse the current motor that we see that's running very fast towards greater and ever greater concentration of ownership of production, and therefore as a result of that, ownership of wealth. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think ordinary people particularly resent inequality in the way that the left say. The left say everyone hates it, and come the glorious day no one will put up with it anymore, and the owners will be put up against a wall. But I don't believe that for a moment. But I do think, just as a matter of economics, greater equality leads to greater shared interest and a greater commonality between people, which makes policy work much better. You get a much less divided society. You don't, for instance, get a tendency towards ever greater tax and spend, putting power in politicians who then become your enemy and very traitorous, because the aims of those politicians are hostile to your interests, necessarily so. So I think equality is probably functionally effective. It is probably a realistic long-term aim, or greater equality. I'm not talking about perfect equality. So that's I would call that fairness. Then the second one I call friendship. I basically mean, by that I mean, well, if employees are paid out of profits, then employees are taking their take-home pay. Well, all of their take-home pay comes out of the same bowl. So in effect, employees are working for each other to the extent that your employees' performance is as important to the money you take home to your family as your own performance. And that creates an incentive for employees to support each other, to coordinate, to cooperate better with one another, to make sure that their colleagues are well motivated and happy doing what they're doing. Now, currently, in the normal course of business, where you turn up at the business, you're paid a wage and you go home, you don't have any incentive to support your colleagues unless you happen to really like a particular colleague. In fact, the reverse is the case. You have the incentive to undermine your colleague in the eyes of the boss, because your pay your wage depends on how good you look in the eyes of the boss. And if the worse your colleagues look, the better you look in comparison. So, I mean, there's little or no incentive to coordinate amongst employees in a traditional business, to coordinate effectively. There's a lot of drivel talked about teamwork, which is quite often a way just for employers to say, do what I say, work harder because I tell you. I'll dress it up as teamwork. That isn't teamwork. The setup of an employee-owned business, I think, is therefore conducive to a more compassionate, mutually understanding society, on the basis that money shapes behaviour and behaviour shapes ethics in a way that confiscatory taxation can't do. Now, the third one is freedom. That's the third thing that I think it creates. Employee-owned businesses are not dependent on the state. The best thing and they're not dependent on some intervention or some subsidy by politicians. The best thing that politicians can do in order to promote employee-owned businesses would be to drop dead en masse. A well-run employee-owned business, I think, runs well being left free to make its own decisions without the complexity of employment law and taxation getting in its way, trying to trip it up. And freedom leads to prosperity. Free societies under law create prosperity. We've seen that since the fall of communism. It's undeniable. A free society which is able effectively to harness incentive and motivation, I think that would lead to extreme prosperity. And the society, a people who are able to harness effectively, to use an effective form of employee ownership, will prosper like no other. I think creating a second industrial revolution in the process. I would go that far. Now these are reasons. These are all reasons why I think employee ownership would be a nice thing, a good thing. But I hope it's easy to see why they would actually, employee ownership would be a nation-building form of economics, and that a society, a people, a nation who are able to get to grips with it effectively could realistically be called a nationalist population, if on the basis that nationhood means or depends upon a sense of belonging and the fondness of home. So how does it work? Let me give you this simple diagram. Let me just do this to show you a simple diagram that explains it a bit. Okay. Now, if you see that down at the bottom there, what you see, that's a traditional form of business, where you have the company, you're the employee, you get paid a wage, a salary, and that's it. You go home on Friday. And at the top is an employee-owned form of business. What you have is the company on the one hand and the employee, and in between, the company issues shares to employees via a trust, and the dividends, i.e. a proportion of the profits, so like 1% of the profit, if there's 100 shares, 1% of the profits go to via each to the owner of each share. So those shares in that trust pay dividends to employees, and that is how employees get paid every year. So if you're an employee and you turn up and you say, well, I'm worth 20 grand a year, instead of getting paid 20 grand a year, you would get put into that trust shares that will yield 20 grand's worth of dividends every year, perhaps a bit more to take account of the risk factor, the ups and downs of business. So that's the simple structure. I don't think there is a way to get around that basic setup for an effective form of employee-owned business. And certainly not the way worker co-ops have been organised. I mean, there's hardly any of them and they don't work. I think this basic setup is the way that it needs to work in order to function, in order to survive. Now, let me show you a more complicated version, just a second. There it is in a little bit more complicated form. Feel free to pause the video and squint at that at your leisure. I won't go through it here because it will be too boring, too technical. But that's a more complicated form. And now that is putting it fairly simply. But there is quite a lot of wiring under the floorboards, a lot of technical stuff to create an effective employee ownership structure. For instance, you can't just hand over 10% of the business, say, or a slice of the business to any new employee who turns up, because that would give them the immediate incentive to take that 10% of the business and say, actually, I've changed my mind, I'm leaving the business, I'm going to work elsewhere, and I'm taking my 10% of the company with me. And then they go and get a job somewhere else, and they're getting 2 salaries for the price of 1. So, and the other thing is, what about external investors? You need to build in a load of protections so that employee shareholders can't vote to shaft external investors who've bought shares in business. Businesses need investment. They tend to get it by selling shares. If an investor knows that buying shares in that business means he'll get shafted out of his money because all the employee shareholders will outvote him, then he's not going to invest in the first place, and that's bad for the business. So that's the kind of complicated wiring that needs to be built in. I'm not going to go through it here because it is technical stuff. It's pretty boring. I've written a lot more about this on my website. I'll leave a link below. There's a whole load of legal documents there which I've constructed, the necessary legal documents to set up the structure. Anyone can use those free of charge if you want, subject to all the caveats. It's at your own risk. Run it past your own lawyers first. I make no warranty that they'll work, but do it for yourself. Now, I have my doubts that this is going to interest a lot of people, but my hope is that it might make some people think, and it might make just a few people stop and take an interest, note it, file it away, and perhaps do something with it at some time in the future. But I'll say this again. People who get to grips with this way of organising business, they won't just make a nicer business, a more equal business, a friendlier form of business, a more government independent, free form of business, but they'll also create, I think, extreme or great prosperity for themselves, and I think a second industrial revolution into the process, getting rich into the bargain, which can't be bad. So thank you.